to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen.
With me today is abundance teacher and money coach, Jody Lynn Craven.
This is your daily dose of happy. We are so happy you decided to join us today.
Okay, Jody Lynn, I'm going to just hit you with a question right off the bat here, just to kind of catch you off guard, okay?
Yeah.
Have you ever been betrayed?
Yes.
Yeah?
Several times.
Several times. Okay.
Yeah.
So you know what that's like.
100%.
Were you able to forgive afterward?
I think mostly.
Mostly?
I want to say yes, but I am a big believer that there's, like, we're never done growing. So maybe that applies to the forgiveness concept, is maybe
Sure.
we never are done forgiving because there's maybe another layer.
Hard. I mean, when you've been betrayed, I mean, it's a major event in your life. It can affect you for about as long as you're willing to give your attention to it, which could be quite a long time.
Yeah,
Forgiveness piece can be a tough one.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm kind of glad we're going to be talking to an expert on how exactly to deal with that situation. His name is Dr. Bruce Chalmer. And dude, I didn't ask you before, but are you Bruce? Are you Dr. Chalmer? What do you like to be called?
was talking with Jody Lynn before you came on. Yes, Bruce. Bruce is fine.
Bruce is good. Okay.
Yes.
That simplifies things. So, well, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today on the program.
I'm delighted to be here.
We're glad to have you. And you got to give us a little bit of background to tell us, first of all, how you ended up in a position of writing a book by that title, because I have a sneaking suspicion there's a lead up there. It's like a storyline there.
There are actually many storylines there, yeah,
Okay.
including in my own life. You know, it's interesting, the question you asked Jody Lynn, have you ever been betrayed? I mean, anybody over the age of, what would you say, 16, 20? You know, if you're a grown up, you've probably been betrayed at one time or another. It's a very common experience. It's a very painful experience, and you know, we don't use the word betrayal lightly. But, you know, why am I writing a book about betrayal? Well, aside from, you know, events of my own life, like, as I say, I'm plenty old to have had that happen. I'm a couples therapist. I've been doing that for 30 years in private practice. And the vast majority of folks that I'm dealing with, I think that's not an overstatement, are dealing with some kind of betrayal. Close to half of the folks I deal with, the couples I deal with, it's flat out infidelity. I mean, that is very, very common in my practice. And even the folks who aren't dealing with infidelity per se, it's often some kind of betrayal or other. And so I realized that primarily I wrote this book. Yeah, where do I get the chutzpah, if you know the word, the gall to write a book like that? It's because I've learned so much from the folks I've worked with. And so the book I wrote really reflects the experiences of lots of folks that I've worked with, from whom I've learned a lot about how you can get through. You know, the subtitle of the book is How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. I've learned a lot from folks about how they can manage to do it. Not everybody can. And Jody Lynn, you're absolutely right. It's a long, you know, it's a lifetime of learning.
Yeah.
But the people who can, I find incredibly inspiring. And I wanted to share that. So that's why I wrote the book.
I love that.
Yeah, that's good. And you're right, it is a fairly common experience, much more common than I think most of us really want to admit to and acknowledge.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has affected, like you say, just about anybody who's of adult age. They've experienced it at one time or another. I actually went through a severe version of it a couple of years ago when my ex-wife left me completely unexpectedly without any prior warning. And it was, first of all, it was a shock. And like you were describing, it just takes time to get past it. And I have a pretty good tool set. I mean, because I do the show, I have lots of people I've interviewed over the years, life coaches, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, social workers, you name it, who I've talked to, who have given me all kinds of really cool tools to use to deal with situations. And I used every single one of them in the midst of that crisis. And it's still really, really challenging to get through.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you know, it's kind of, it's inherent in the definition of betrayal. When you think about, we don't call something a betrayal unless it's a very painful, you know, it's somebody doing something that you never thought would do that to you based on your relationship with them.
Right.
That's more or less how I define it. And it's so kind of by definition, then it's going to hurt badly because it's somebody who's important to you. You don't call it a betrayal if some random person just sort of cut you off in traffic or something.
No, well, some people might.
Yeah, but I mean, usually I'm reserving the word betrayal for there's a relationship where you have some expectations of someone, and they grossly violate the expectations in ways that you never thought were possible. And so, it's not merely that you've been hurt, which is bad enough. I mean, look, people hurt each other, people annoy each other, people hurt each other. But betrayal is when somebody does something that makes you not only question who they are, but questions who you are. It's like, why didn't I see that coming?
Exactly.
How a lot of, as we may get into if we talk more about the forgiveness piece, the first step in forgiveness is always forgiving yourself. Because there's always some element of self-blame, or almost always some element of self-blame involved.
Yeah, very true. In my own case, my ex-wife is a former psychotherapist, and the last thing I would have bet every single dollar I had in the bank that, even though I knew there was something that was bothering her, I couldn't get her to talk about it. It was always very simple answers. I said, "Well, she'll address it when she's ready. She knows how important communication is."
Yeah.
And so you can imagine.
Yes. Yeah. Would that I could say that psychotherapists have any greater call on healthy ways of being than anybody else does. And there's a case to be made. I don't want to be cynical about it at all. I mean, a lot of us get into it because we're dedicated to it, but also a lot of us get into it to deal with our own, our own issues that have hurt us. We've learned from it. There's all kinds of reasons why people do it, but we're certainly not any better at living than anybody else is. And I make a point of remembering that consciously when I'm working with folks. I am not an expert in how they should live their lives. I'm an expert at having certain kinds of conversations that maybe will be helpful, but I'm certainly not an expert in how they should live their lives.
That feels like a different approach than a standard psychiatrist, psychologist, like a doctor, if you will.
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not by no means unique in this concept, but it is a way. Yeah, it's funny. I've been doing it for a long time now, and I'm not young anymore. I'm in my 70s. When I was younger, I used to be so precious about not being an expert that I would ignore the fact that, I've learned a couple things along the way. And maybe, funny thing, people paying money to come to see somebody like me actually would like to get some good ideas. And maybe it's okay if I share them. I don't have to be so precious about saying, no, we're just here to have the process. And, I can't tell you what to do. I mean, I'll make suggestions, I'll speak up. But I really, it's a deeply held, it's kind of my brand that I don't claim to know better than the people I'm working with how they should be in their lives. And then, I think when people sense genuine respect in that sense, that's when they're open to ideas. That's when you get, that's when that happens.
And when you mentioned the second word in the title, the forgiveness, like you said, it does start with forgiving yourself, which is really difficult to do shortly after you've had a trauma like that.
It sure is. Yeah. And I mean, I can, if you like, I can kind of walk you through what I mean by forgiveness, because people use the term in different ways. And it's, I'm sure I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but what the heck?
Well, you wrote the book. It's okay.
I wrote the book, so
oversimplify. It's you, I would say. Fair enough.
And I invite people who are watching this, buy the book and then quibble with me.
There you go.
That's cool. I'm really open to that. People use the word forgiveness, broadly speaking, in two different ways. And there's the way I like and the way I don't. So, of course, I'm going to use it the way I like, but I better tell you the way I don't. It's very common. I don't mean to be silly about it. Often people will say, well, if I forgive you, that means we'll restore our relationship. That means I can trust you again. That means we can get back to where we were. And I don't use it that way at all. I use forgiveness, and this is not a phrase that I coined. I think I heard it from somebody in 12-step program. I'm not in 12-step myself, but I talk to lots of people who are. And somebody said, no, forgiveness is an inside job. Yes. In other words, and lots of people like to quote Anne Lamott, who has a wonderful quote about this, the novelist. She said, I probably won't get it exact, to not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. It's basically to carry around the anger, the hurt, the obsession. Is hurting yourself. So when I use the word forgiveness, what I mean is, no, you get past that obsession. You get past that sense of trauma. you're not immediately sent into panic or anger or overwhelming pain when you think about it. That's what I mean by forgiveness. So with that definition, and I think it's a pretty important part of it, you can forgive somebody you don't trust at all. You can forgive somebody you have no intention of ever having another relationship with. You can forgive somebody and still sue them in court or divorce them or prosecute them. All of those things are possible and still forgive them. And I think that's an important piece of it, because that means that the issue of forgiveness is really all about recovering yourself. And then maybe you can think about, okay, what do I want to do with my relationship with this person? If somebody, important to me has betrayed me, if I can get past the overwhelming pain, then I can at least think clearly about, okay, are there ways we could rebuild trust? Do I want to remain in a relationship with this person, or do I want to transform it? If I'm married to somebody, do I want to divorce them? Or, lots of people don't have the option of having no relationship with someone who hurt them. For example, if they're parents of the same kids, and they can get a divorce, but they can't not be in each other's lives somehow. They can try, but they're going to be there one way or another.
Right.
And so if you can find forgiveness, that certainly makes that relationship go a lot better. So indeed, as we were talking about, the first step, I talk about 3 steps to forgiveness. So step 1, forgive yourself. And what does it mean to forgive yourself? It means essentially, if I look back on whatever it is and I said, oh, why didn't I see that coming? Your ex-wife, suddenly left you. Why didn't you see that coming? Well, because you only knew what you knew and you didn't know what you didn't know. And there's nothing wrong with you. You're not, as I so often say to virtually all the couples I meet, you're not crazy. You're not stupid. You're not evil. You're doing the best you can. You didn't know what you didn't know. And when you can realize that about yourself, that's when you can say, oh, I wish I'd known better, but I didn't know better. I guess I was doing the best I could. And then I don't have to be angry at myself. Yeah. I can say, well, painful lesson learned, but good for me, lesson learned, That's forgiving yourself. Step 2 is to forgive whoever hurts you. And I claim, and it's probably one of those things people are welcome to quibble about, I claim that's a pretty short step from step 1, because if I can genuinely forgive myself, if I can genuinely say, you know what, I didn't know. I wish I'd known. I can see, with hindsight, I can see the signs, but I didn't at the time. Well, you know what? Again, not to pick on your ex-wife, but you know what? I don't know your ex-wife. She was doing the best she could too, on some level. You can be critical after the fact, but I'm sure she's not crazy, stupid, or evil either. She's who she is. She's a human being like we all are. And so she was doing the best she could too. So you don't have to be angry. You can just say, well, if I can forgive myself, I guess I can forgive her too. Step 3, I have a funny term for, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate this term. I call it forgive God. And what I mean by forgive God is, and for folks who are religious, that's sometimes a weird concept for them. It's like, no, we need God to forgive us, right? But whether or not you're religious, it's sort of forgiving the world for being a place where that sort of thing happens. We have this tantalizing sense that we can control stuff, and we sort of can, but mostly can't. And we have to forgive the idea that this is the reality we have. And another word I bandy about a lot in talking about forgiving God is simply the word faith. And all I mean by the word faith is you accept the rightness of reality. It's like, yeah, there's something right about this whole business, even though it's painful and there's a lot of stuff happening I don't understand or couldn't have anticipated. Somehow it's right to be what it is. And the people who manifest faith are the ones who can do the hard work of healing. They can actually look at stuff and not freak out and figure, wow, that, I guess it had to be that way. I wish it didn't. I wish I'd known better, but I'm going to work with it instead of insisting it not be what it was. And that's how healing happens, I think.
That's an interesting three-piece process you have described there. The reason I say interesting is because one of the concepts that I always took on board where forgiveness was concerned is that rather than the conventional idea that forgiveness is for the benefit of the person you're forgiving, I take it that that forgiveness is for the benefit of the person doing the forgiving.
I have whole sections in the book about that. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, precisely. Forgiveness is about you, not about the person you're forgiving. Totally. The way I define it, totally about that. It has almost nothing to do with the other person. If you haven't forgiven them, it's going to be very difficult to trust them, because it's going to be difficult to not freak out when you're in their presence or even thinking about them. But just because you've forgiven them doesn't mean, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean you're going to want to restore a relationship. It's a whole different question. So really, indeed, forgiveness, as I said, it's an inside job. It's for the benefit of the one doing the forgiving. It's a way of getting the poison out of you.
And I found personally that it's not a one and done thing.
Very true.
Right. I've had to go through in my mind many times forgiving my ex. Each time I was better than I was the last time.
Yeah.
But it just kept coming back over time. Like just when I thought I had it, not so much.
People who write 3-step processes, full of baloney. Let's face it. and now it's sorry for the segue here, but I'm even going to put in a plug for the book I wrote before this one because of the snarky title and subtitle. The book I wrote before this is called "It's Not About." Here, I'll hold it up. It's not about communication. Whoops, there it is. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong.
It's wrong.
Wow.
And I note in one of the last chapters, this is a spoiler alert for people who haven't read the book. In one of the last chapters, I note, by the way, that little bit about everything you know about couples therapy is wrong applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. The problem not being ideas, the problem being thinking I know. In other words, when ideas close down into ideologies, like my 3 steps. I always groan slightly when I see somebody's 3-step, solution to something, and what do? I write one myself, But I always groan a little bit about it because that's exactly as you said. Nah, come on, it's not exactly that. That's a handy way of understanding it. It's helpful. It helps you move along. Real life is much more complicated than anybody's 3 steps. It reminds like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Even she said not everybody does it in that order. You know what I'm referring to. What is it? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I think I got those.
The 5. Okay, yeah. Okay.
The 5 of them are 5 steps. Yeah, and but that's not how it goes.
Not
it's not like, oh, you're not doing it right. No, you're doing it the way you're doing it.
It reminds me of a time before our breakup where my ex's stepmother had passed on, and she had passed on about 6 or 7 months before this particular incident, where it just kind of overcame her. Like she realized she couldn't talk to her anymore, and it was just really bothering her and so forth. And I'll never forget the incident because I really had no idea how to help her. So I just kind of went with the first thing that came to me because it came to me. I had nothing else to do. So I might as well do this because I don't know what else to do. It was one of those situations. And I literally got down on the floor in front of the chair where she was sitting and looked at her and I said, I didn't know your stepmother really well. Tell me what you loved about her. And she started telling me. And within about 5 minutes, she said, how'd you do that? You just bypassed the 5 steps of grief.
It came to you at the right moment.
Yeah, right.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Beginner's luck.
Yeah.
Or just your intuition.
Maybe, I guess.
Well, it's beautiful. You just offered love, really. You offered love, and you invited her to reflect in a loving way, which is just, what's that going to produce? That's going to produce loving feelings. If it were me, I'd be crying as I did it. I'm well imagining, Yeah, it's it. Grief is an interesting process. It's like I remember moments in my own life going way back where I remember I've often cited this one as just interesting. There was I had some loss maybe a year before, and I was changing the storm windows in the house that I lived in, and the light hit me a particular way that it hadn't hit me except the year before, and I started crying. It was really it just got me just like that. And grief operates that way a lot. And of course, the grief of betrayal, which is a huge part of betrayal, it comes often, it doesn't come in nice, neat little packages, does it?
That's right. That's right.
You can schedule your bad feelings right here and here,
Conveniently.
Yeah.
Not exactly.
Would it be nice to just schedule it, make it really easy?
Mhm.
That'd be cool. Yeah, that'd be nice.
I would just delay.
Well, and people sort of do that. I mean, you kind of learn to do that. If you're having to work or you're having to take care of the kids or you're having to do whatever you're doing, people will delay it. They'll say, no, I can't give myself over to that right now. And then they'll break down later. Or, first responders do that all the time. A lot of my career, I was working with folks who'd been traumatized one way or another. I'm trained in EMDR, if you're familiar with that, and hypnosis also. And it was often I worked with a number of first responders, and they would click into their training mode, and then they'd go to pieces later because they couldn't go to pieces when they were actually on the job. Yeah,
they just needed to be there.
And parents will do that too. I've had folks who were fine until their youngest kid, like graduated from high school or something, and then they went to pieces dealing with trauma that had happened as children. Happened to them as children. They that wasn't conscious, but they just delayed it. Said, I can't lose my stuff now. I'm not sure what your language code is here, so I'm sort of avoiding words that I might have otherwise used. Losing their stuff,
Like I tell all of our guests, the FCC have absolutely nothing to do with the show. So
so they can lose their shit, not just lose their stuff, right?
That's
just
right.
checking. Yes,
I tend to keep it clean, but don't follow my example. Do what's natural for you.
Okay. Yeah.
But well, I agree with you that they're connected concepts. I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to touch on the grief for a moment, because when we're talking about not just the betrayal piece, but the forgiveness piece, that are the two cornerstones of your book title, I think what we're really talking about kind of reflects to what we touched on earlier, that you do it in stages. It doesn't happen all at once.
Right.
And because of that, you're going to bounce around. I mean, you can bounce over to grief. You can come back to forgiveness. You can bounce back to being betrayed again. I mean, it's not linear.
It is not linear. Life is not linear. That's not how we operate. It's organic. Yeah.
And that just creates complexity. And the complexity, I think, shows up as, when am I going to get over this?
Yes. Oh, which of course, understandably, I hear that a lot. When I'm working with a couple that's trying to recover from one of them having betrayed the other, they're both thinking that, of course, usually in different ways. The one who, like, if somebody, let's say, cheated on their spouse, the one who cheated is feeling like, when are they going to get over it? And the one who was cheated on is often saying, when am I going to get over it? It is because it's so painful. Yeah,
and because of that ambiguity, I guess is the word, that uncertainty, maybe that's the better word. Because of that uncertainty, it can feel that's what I think you can really feel like you're losing control, because you do your best, you use your tools, you go to the therapist, you start doing all this stuff, and then you have that moment where you feel like you didn't get anywhere at all. Like, what happened to all that work I did? I'm right back where I was at the very beginning of this whole thing. Yeah.
And of course, from an outside perspective, no, you're not. You know what I mean? From an outside perspective, all that work you've done actually is paying off.
Yes.
It just isn't going to prevent all of those moments where it just feels like, oh no, I'm back in despair. And that is indeed part of the process. It's tolerance of that complexity that has, tolerance of, anybody who works with me knows I'm a sucker for a good paradox,
Okay.
I love ironies, it's like, ironically, you're going to have to tolerate the fact that you can, over the course of 10 minutes, you can be 5 different people. You can be all over the place with respect to how you feel about that stuff. In fact, I love to put in a plug for Jill Bolte Taylor. Do you know that name?
Yeah.
You may, I'll bet you've heard of her most famous TED Talk, which is called My Stroke of Insight.
Yes.
Yeah, she's very well known for that. It's well worth checking out the 18 minutes of her TED Talk. It's the first TED Talk that went viral back in 2008. I think it was like the 8th TED Talk ever, and it was the first one that went viral. And her thing is, I think now she's in her 60s, I believe. When she was in her 30s, back in the 1990s, I believe, she had a massive left hemisphere hemorrhagic stroke.
Right.
Pretty young to have that happen. Happens to be a neuroscientist. Wow. Who better than a neuroscientist once she is able to talk again and write again? It took her a number of years. I forgot how many years she said it took
And if
before
I
she
remember
really
correctly,
felt.
while she's going through the stroke, she's saying, "I'm having a stroke. I'm going to
Oh
analyze
yeah,
as I'm having a stroke."
yeah. She knew exactly what was happening, and she,
Yeah.
down
Crazy.
to the cellular level.
Right.
It's like she's an expert.
Right.
And she wasn't able to say that at the time,
That's right.
but yeah, she remembered all of that, and
Yeah.
she wrote about it. So her first book was called My Stroke of Insight. Well, the reason I keep bringing up Jill Bolte Taylor when I'm working with folks often, it's relevant to what we were just talking about. She wrote a second book later on, much later on. So it just came out, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, called Whole Brain Living. And her essential thesis is, it's based on neuroscience. Her essential thesis is we are all at least 4 different people walking around.
Okay.
And the reason she says 4 different people, and she has 4 different, she says character 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's who we are. And she suggests we should all give them whimsical names, as she does. I forgot what her names were. They were funny names. She said you should get to know your own 4 and give them whimsical names. And it's based on left and right hemisphere, and then upper and lower, respectively. Oh. So it's the left hemisphere neocortex and right hemisphere neocortex, left hemisphere midbrain or limbic system, and right hemisphere midbrain. It's the left hemisphere amygdala that freaks out. Oh, that's character 2 in her parlance. Character 2 is the one that freaks out. The other 3, it's funny, I was talking to my wife about this when I was reading the book. She hadn't read the book. And I was saying, gee, she hears this woman saying we should have 4 different characters. What would you name your 4? I explained it briefly. She said immediately, oh, I know, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And there's something to that. There's something about the Beatles sort of represented those 4 different character types. That's what made them
which
so
one
amazing.
Which Beatle is number 2? That's what I want to know.
Well, the one that's freaking out a lot. Yeah, who would that be? That would be George. Although no, George is the one who's like at one with the universe. Ringo is the one. He's definitely the character that is the right hemisphere limbic system. It just wants to have fun. That's Ringo. Yeah,
that makes sense.
I don't know what you do with John and Paul, but maybe John's the one who's freaking out, and Paul's the one who's. John is number 2. Yeah, I think John is number 2. Yeah, because he's the one who's going to express all the angst and stuff like that, right. and Paul is the linear, analytical, and clear, and let's just get this done. I don't know, whatever. We should interview the 2 remaining surviving Beatles and see what they think. But that concept that we're all multiple people is so. People, when I've explained this to them and I've steered them to that book, and they found it really useful to understand what's going on in those moments when you are seemingly simultaneously freaking out, understanding, hating, screaming, all of the above. Yeah. And what Jill Bolte Taylor talks about, and what was interesting for her, she said she came up with this because being without 2 of those characters effectively for a number of years, she was more or less without her left hemisphere. The function she was working with was all right hemisphere stuff. So she was like holistic. And she said she didn't know how to stay pissed off. Oh, it's not that she didn't get uncomfortable. She found some people she liked and some she didn't. And, the ones who would be sort of slow and relaxed and understanding she could like. And the ones who weren't, just it would be irritating. But she said it takes your left hemisphere to keep you pissed off because you have to keep reciting it to yourself. It's a narrative process.
Interesting.
Yeah. If you don't keep insisting that you should be pissed off and telling yourself why, she said it's about 90 seconds that left hemisphere amygdala will calm down. It's that function in the brain is there to say, this is seriously reminding me of some really dangerous times. You better panic, And if you don't keep reciting why you should panic, or if you're not actually under attack, it'll calm down in about a minute and a half. So, the advice people will say that if you can take, it's just 90 seconds, take a minute and a half. You don't even have to leave the room necessarily. If everybody's, it's like, get a hold of yourself. If you just stop reciting why you should be so pissed off. The trouble is we're very good at doing that.
Oh yeah.
Because we're all good at justifying why we're pissed off because, I know I'm right and everybody else is wrong,
Of course. Yeah.
Although, as I said in my other book, I'm wrong too, but that I can be pissed off at myself, I guess.
I think that before you wrote that, I'm just kind of curious.
I don't recall. Part of me probably was.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most difficult things that I've dealt with in terms of betrayal is that right and wrong, process, whatever, the first thing when you asked me, well, have I been betrayed? I thought of, I had 2 best friends who were like my whole world. We did everything together. And then I had started to go through a spiritual awakening, started to develop in different ways. So I could see now, looking back, I could see that there was this gap between us. But when I was in that moment, it was, I had an ectopic pregnancy, had a surgery, almost died, and then they didn't show up.
Ooh,
They pretty much
ouch.
ghosted me.
Yeah,
And then,
yeah.
to this day, I think I've talked to them once since that happened. And that was in
Wow.
2019. So that was really hard. And dealing with it, moving through it, the one thing I was stuck on for about a year was how right I was and how I wanted them to acknowledge that I was right. And it was interesting because when it hit me, because I kept coming back to them over and over again, even though I had no contact with them, I didn't want a relationship with them. They weren't reaching out to me to have a relationship either. There was no reason for them to come up, but it just kept coming up. And I was, with my dad, we were going somewhere and it just hit me. Oh, I want them to acknowledge the pain of what I'm feeling right now. I want them to realize they're shitty friends. I want them to say that. And then I thought it through, okay, what is this going to give me? Well, it'll make me right. And then I'm justified. And I was like, oh, okay. And then what? Nothing. Okay, great.
Well, yeah, if it's just that, then what? Nothing. Of course, everything you're saying is not a weird way to feel. You were hurting and you thought these were your friends, and you had, again, it's a betrayal in that sense. You had an expectation of them as your friends who you had loved and done lots of things together. Yeah. That they would at least show up when you're going through some life-threatening circumstances, and they just didn't. And but you're absolutely right. If you get stuck there on needing to be right, that's when it becomes very difficult to heal that breach. If you have any intention of ever healing it with them. And even if you don't, to let go of the anger yourself. Well, it seems like you have a fair amount.
That's really what I wanted to do. I had kind of separated, just like your definition, I wasn't sure that I would ever have a relationship with them. And I haven't really thought about it because I don't see them anymore. So I don't really have to think about it, but I'm not reaching out to them to foster a new relationship. But I just really wanted to move past that hurt that I was feeling and that sting that I had, because I didn't want to bring that into my other relationships. But it was fascinating in my mind, I want them to acknowledge how shitty they were.
Yes.
And then the other thing that played in my mind was, okay, if I got what I wanted and they acknowledged that, then what? And the realization for me was I wouldn't believe them anyway.
Well, at least, and again, initially, perhaps you wouldn't. My wife and I do a podcast, which we even have merch. It's called Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Cool.
The 7 words there's 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's the 7 words. Okay. One of my books actually sort of oriented around those 7 words. But we do a podcast, and among the folks, we've done 200 episodes now. And among the folks who we've interviewed was a man named Carl Pillemer, who's an academic at Cornell University. And he wrote a book a few years ago, the name of which, Fault Lines. I was going to say the name of which is escaping me, but I found it. Fault Lines. And he's not a clinician, he's a sociologist. So he studies these things, and he did a nationwide survey in the United States of folks about who had experienced, I would say family betrayals. He talks about it as cutoffs, who had experienced estrangement, family estrangement, either family or close friends. That your story, Jody Lynn, would fit that as well. And he found it was very, very, very common. At any given time, according to his research, about a quarter of Americans, at least, are currently in some sort of estrangement. That's not even ever in their life. That's about a quarter of people at any given time from some important person. It doesn't necessarily have to be a parent or a child and he was excluding spouses, by the way. He said, no, never mind divorce. That's been studied all sorts of ways. So what he found, your story reminded me of this, because one of the things he found was a subset of people who had successfully reconnected, often after decades. There were stories that he was telling, people who hadn't spoken to a sibling in 40 years, that kind of thing. And not everybody did it successfully, but everybody who tried, which was a subset of the people he interviewed, was at least glad they tried. And the ones who succeeded, and all he means by succeeded is they reconnected and they reestablished some kind of relationship that wasn't horrible. That's really what he meant. And what he found, that the people who were able to do that were often the ones who stopped saying to themselves pretty much what you were saying, Jody Lynn, that you stopped saying to yourself. They stopped saying, I need them to understand. I need an apology. I need them to understand how awful they were back then when our parents died and how terrible they were about, being the executor of the will or whatever it was. And when they did that, what they found was they could get in contact. And if the other party was willing, to get in contact, it would be superficial initially because they decided, you know what, it's been years. We're different people. How have you been for the last decades, And it would be superficial at first. And then often what would happen after the ice had been broken for a bit, one or the other would say, I really want to say how sorry I am about that whole thing that went down back then. I was really kind of a jerk. And I'm really sorry. And the other person will say, yeah, I was a jerk too. And they'll find it. They'll find it in their heart to reconnect. Doesn't always happen.
Sure.
Yeah.
But if it was going to happen, that's how it would happen, because it's rare that somebody would say, well, I want to reconnect with you, but only if you apologize. Well, that's rarely going to get you anyplace.
Yeah. No kidding. It's
Yeah.
really funny that you say that, because right after I had that realization and I was like, okay, I'm ready to let this go. Like, I don't need to be right. What is right anyway? Like, I don't know what was going on in their lives at that moment. Like, it could be happenstance that it happened at the exact same time when I needed them the most. Like, I know that there's two sides of the story and somewhere in the middle is truth. So I know that I'm biased. So I let that go. And then I think it was a few months later, I had another friend who was with one of these friends at like a shower or like some sort of like, I think it was a baby shower or a wedding shower or something like that. And the two of them had started to connect. And the one that I felt betrayed by had opened up to this other one and said, I didn't understand spirituality or, like this. And I was really nervous about it. And I lost a really good friend and I regret it.
Wow.
And that person came back to me and said, I knew she was talking about you the whole time. Yeah. And I was like, okay, well, that's nice. That's wonderful. I got a little bit of closure.
Sure. Well, I'm going to imagine, it's a very different feeling to think, oh, she was afraid, not she was, she hated me and she said to heck with me. It's like, no, she was afraid. She had fear.
Afraid.
And we all have fears,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It can sometimes be a surprise to find out what the fear was.
Boy, can it ever. Yeah. It's interesting, that story also, Jody Lynn, that you were saying. I'm realizing that in my own life when I went through a divorce 20 some years ago. I like to tell the story of my first marriage. Both my ex and I went on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's how that went down. So
worked out.
It worked out. We all get along. It's nice. Our kids have all these, multiple grandmothers and not quite as many grandfathers. But in any case, going through that process, I was surprised at the people who showed up to be supportive and the people who just didn't. And I didn't get any hostile reactions, but there are people who I thought they were my friends. I would have thought they would be inquiring and saying, how you doing? And gee, this must be painful. And then there were people who I sort of barely knew who would just show up and be incredible.
Yeah.
And with hindsight, I think it's fear, and I know the feeling. It's, it's a scary thing when somebody's going through something that you're afraid of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. As you mentioned that, it made me think of a very famous story that got a fair amount of press attention, but it involved two very famous people, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Because when Magic Johnson was diagnosed with HIV,
I remember that day, actually.
Do you really? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember where it was when I heard it. It's funny.
Okay. Yeah. Well, when that happened, and of course, he was the first publicly known one to have been diagnosed who did not have a homosexual relationship. So that was adding on top of it all. He talked later about how many of his closest friends in the NBA shunned him. And the thing that stunned him was when he got a phone call from his greatest rival, Larry Bird. I mean, the Bird Johnson rival was the rivalry. Everybody in the NBA knew it. All the fans knew it. I mean,
sure.
the whole thing associated with it. And it was Larry who got on the phone to find out if he was okay. And Magic was stunned, absolutely stunned.
Yeah.
And from that point on, they had the closest friendship that you could possibly have.
Yeah, they were the best of enemies, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's neat.
So it goes to show that even if you're in a situation where you feel like you've been betrayed, you can also get unexpected support coming from a completely unanticipated quarter.
Yeah. 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 And you know what often happens, and this is, of course, jumping to the end of a lot of work, but what often happens when people have healed and gone through it and learned and grown, you know, all of those things, they will express gratitude. I've never had anybody in my office say, "Oh, thanks for cheating." Never heard that one. But close, you know, I've had numbers of people say in varying ways, "Thank you for precipitating a crisis that, you know, with hindsight clearly had to happen. We're so much better off now." I remember one, I quote this, I think, in one of my books, that a woman who turned to her husband. It was our last session. This was pre-pandemic, and I was actually in an office rather than, I do all telehealth now, but it was pre-pandemic. And so they were leaving town, and they'd done like a year and a half of incredibly hard work. When they first came to see me, they were just in horrible pain. The woman had like lost 30 pounds in 4 weeks or something. And just, you know, she was just a mess. And it was the man who had done the cheating, and he realized he had an alcohol problem and got, you know, in serious trouble on his job and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, they were doing amazing work. And last session, she turned, you know, they were talking about how much better everything was, not only between them, but with their relationship with their kids. And she was talking about her relationship with her coworkers. She was just so much less freaked out by things, having gone through this crisis and come through it. And so she turned to her husband and said, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team." And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, you're the one who did the thing you had to feel guilty about." You know, she didn't say thanks for cheating, you know.
Right.
I mean, no, there was nobody, none of the three of us were under any illusions that it was just fine to cheat. You know, we were all thinking, "Oh, no, that was wrong," you know. But she was saying, "Well, you know, you felt appropriately guilty. You put yourself through that." She was saying to herself, "Well, at least I didn't have to feel guilty. You know, I feel sort of bad in hindsight for ways I've treated you over the years, but that's different, you know, but I wasn't the one who broke the big rules. So thanks for taking one for the team, because look how much better off we are." And you know, she meant it. She was sincere about that.
You're reminding me of a comment that was made by a friend of ours who joined us on the show a few weeks back, David Strickle, who is a former co-host, made the comment about my divorce, but also about other people who've gone through similar situations, having passed through a course that he teaches. He calls it the TIA boot camp. TIA stands for Trust Your Abundance. And it's a boot camp that has some quasi-therapeutic aspects to it. It's not with a therapist, but a number of the things that you do are similar to what happens in therapy. And he made the comment that people who go through boot camp often find that their relationships end because the people have grown in different directions.
Yeah,
one person, you know, achieved some growth, and the other person wasn't doing the same kind of growth. And so all of a sudden there was a separation going on that neither one of them was really paying attention to, but it was there, and it just kind of, you know, broke things down.
Yeah. And that certainly can happen. You know, people will sometimes ask, you know, couples therapists, like, "What's your success rate?" You know, and I do not measure success by whether or not they stay together. I don't keep track of that statistic anyway, because I don't think that's not the relevant point. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I often will comment to people, "Hey, I do have a bias," and it's a bias. I'm identifying it as a bias. My bias is toward helping people stay together because that makes my heart sing. It's like this. I'm an old romantic, you know, that's nice. And of course, it's far less disruptive. If they can actually want to do that, that's great.
Sure.
But often, you know, a successful outcome is they're realizing, sadly, you know what, we're not right for each other. Let's make the best of this, but let's not try to stay together. And I find those every bit as inspiring as the ones who can find each other again. You know, it's, you know, the things that I would say aren't successful outcomes are where they just can't figure out what to do, or they break up in a panic or something like that. And again, that's, you know, that it's not up to me to define whether it's successful or not anyway. It's really up to the couple, but they often don't agree on that.
Right.
So there's three different opinions about what's successful. Mine, I think, being the least important. It's the couple's opinions that are the important ones for themselves, of course. And they don't always agree. So it's not always obvious what's a success. But sometimes I think we can all acknowledge, yeah, the success here is you found a way to go forward that isn't together, but you could do it in ways that are still loving.
And we've been touching on here a number of different aspects to the whole overall situation. I'm realizing that in doing so, we're also touching on many of the, what word do I want to use to apply it? The focal points, the turning points, however you want to describe them, that are involved in that process we were describing earlier, where you make some progress and then you fall back. You make some progress and you fall back. You make progress,
Sure.
and it seems like it takes forever to get past all of it, because you're going through all this stuff that we've been itemizing here, and this is only just a small chunk of the possible stuff you can go through.
Yeah. It's interesting what people, I don't I'm not quite arrogant enough. I'm pretty arrogant, but I'm not quite arrogant enough to lay out a simple process like my 3 steps to forgiveness as if it was just 1, 2, 3. That's not how it works. But in terms of some sort of stages, I guess I'm shying away from the word stages. Some moments that people will often go through, I'll often comment, and here's where I'm glad I asked you about the language code. I have what I like to call the oh shit moment.
Okay.
And in fact, I could say a lot of couples therapy, a lot of the sessions I'll do with folks is about inviting them to get to the oh shit moment. And I dramatize it by calling it a moment. It's really a bunch of moments. What is an oh shit moment? An oh shit moment, it's not like, oh, I just hit my thumb with a hammer. It's not that one. It's the one where you say, oh shit, that's what's going on here. That's why you feel that way. I understand now. Oh shit. And the reason, and of course I could call it an aha moment, but it's not an aha moment because it doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
It's not like, oh good, we've got a way out. It's great. Yeah, that's an aha moment. Those are lovely. I wish that on everybody, But oh shit moments are much more about, oh my God, we don't have to squabble anymore. I see where you're coming from and you see where I'm coming from. And we haven't figured this out yet. We don't know if this is going to work, but it's an intimate moment. It's a moment of very deep intimacy. And it's another way of describing the whole process. It's inviting intimate moments where you actually, what I mean by intimacy in a broad sense, I'm not just talking about sex. I'm talking about when you're present and honest with yourself and each other. And that's not easy. The chief, this one of the little lectures I like to give in the first session, and I structure, the first session is the only one I really structure, but I structure it around an understanding of folks that, what we need in relationships is both stability and intimacy. And the skills you need for stability are quite different from the skills you need for intimacy. In fact, they're sort of in tension with each other. But the chief skill of stability is about keeping the anxiety level low. The chief skill of intimacy is tolerating anxiety without freaking out. And it's the ability to tolerate that anxiety. That's what an oh shit moment is. It's like, oh, it hasn't solved it, but it's like, whoa, no wonder we're having this problem. And then maybe you have a shot at actually hearing yourself, hearing each other. Intimacy is growth. And, that's when growth happens. When a plant is growing, intimacy is the energy for growth. And if that gets, one of my favorite metaphors, if somebody paves a sidewalk over it, it's going to crack the sidewalk or die trying.
Oh yeah.
And couples find lots of ways of cracking the sidewalk when intimacy is compromised.
Well, I've also noticed, particularly since my divorce, one thing that has been one of the more interesting positives, I think you could describe it, of the divorce is getting back into the singles world and having my eyes open to what it's like today, because it's substantially different from the last time I was single.
I'm guessing that was a while ago, right?
Yeah, it was 23 years previous. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, it is, isn't it?
It was quite different. There was a lot of similarity. I mean, certain things, don't go out of style, if you will, but a lot of it was quite different. One of the things, though, that really stood out to me and continues to stand out to me is, especially using your word intimacy, the way you're defining it, the way you're using it here in your sentences, is how many people who are dealing with struggles associated with trying to find a new partner or finding a partner for the first time, either way, will have had different kinds of intimacy situations in the past that they tried their level best to avoid addressing.
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And that's another thing, of course, that you'll hear from a lot of couples therapists, which I agree with, which is you even if you're going to end up splitting up, you do well to understand it as well as you can, because otherwise you're just going to keep repeating the same problems.
That's right. Yeah. And then people get frustrated because they keep attracting the same partners over and over again, and that must be the partner's fault. It must be something wrong with them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At a certain point, you kind of have to look at the common denominator. And again, I don't mean to be cynical.
Great way to piss somebody off, by the way. You want to get into a fight with somebody, tell them that you're the common denominator. Oh my goodness.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, I don't mean to be unkind in saying that. You know what I mean? Because look, we're all the common denominator. But no, it's true that you do well to learn from whatever happened. That's betrayal's a great teacher. Painful as hell, but a great teacher. We
Mhm.
learn a lot more from painful stuff than we do from pleasure. And I'm all for pleasure. Don't get me wrong. It's like, hey, I'm all for happy. This
That actually pissed
your
me off
dose
for
of
a long
happy.
time. Realizing just how much we learn from painful stuff compared to everything else. It's for a while there, it seemed really unfair that had to be the way it was.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess if not to be too simplistic, but you should think of it in evolutionary terms. The stuff that hits you is the stuff you're going to learn from. The stuff where everything's working, you're just going to keep doing what you're doing, and it works fine. So you're going to learn from the stuff that didn't work. It's like, this requires change.
Mhm.
See, it's so clear when you say it that way.
Yeah.
And easy.
Well, it's easy to say when you're not freaking out. Yeah.
When you're not freaking out, right?
As I often point out, by the way, to the couples I work with, I will often put in the phrase, hey, I realize this falls under the category easy for me to say. My job, among other things, what can therapists say? Our job is to be the calm nervous system in the conversation. Because that's why you can't, that's why therapists can't work with their own families. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that's why therapists freak out like everybody else does. I mean, you have to work with people that's pretty much your only relationship, so that you can not freak out. And, and that's not to say I don't have genuine care for the folks I work with. A lot of the job, if you're doing it well, you love the people you're working with, but not in a selfish way, but it feels like sacred work. It's really important work.
And you're not as attached to the problem or what is the situation that's going on. So you can stay calm and level-headed and see many sides of the scenario where they can't.
Yes, exactly. And that's, of course that's useful. And people will say that it's just useful to get somebody else's perspective. And of course, I'm thinking, somebody else's perspective who's not freaking out. And so I can imagine things that, and again, not to say that everything I imagine is going to be better, but it's different. And sometimes just being different, being a little off the wall can be helpful. I have my favorite opening question, and I will, spoiler alert for anybody who ever works with me. Once I've done my little confidentiality speech, which is very brief, sort of disclosures about having to report child abuse and things like that. I'll say, okay, here's my favorite opening question. How will you know if this is helping? I didn't invent that. I kind of cribbed it from someone and modified it slightly years ago. But what's most useful about that question is less about the question itself and more about the fact that it's not exactly what they were expecting.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to play games, but it's like, if I just said what's wrong, or if I, whatever, they've already got that story. And that story is part of what's been keeping them stuck. And I'm not denying their wisdom. I'm just observing better to ask them something that invites them to think about it differently.
Yeah.
And right from the get-go, they're thinking in terms of what's better going to look like, which is a nice orientation to have right in the beginning. It's like, oh, there's a better. And moreover, it's inviting them to be the judge of that. How will you know if this is helping? So I'm inviting them right from the get-go, evaluate, is this process helping? Because it doesn't help everybody, I'm sorry to say. It helps a lot of people. But better to find out sooner rather than later, saying, you're an interesting guy, but you're the wrong guy for me. That's cool. I'm cool with that. I'm not the right person for everybody. And, just to focus people right on that from the get-go is useful. But again, it's mostly about just that you weren't, and people will often say that, oh, that's a good question. I don't think they mean it's such a good question. I think they mean that's an unexpected question that isn't pissing me off.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
That usually is a good question when we define that way. But you also mentioned something that I wanted to touch on tangentially, very briefly, just to see what your take is on it. Because you mentioned that you have a genuine love for the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
And the first thing that came to my mind is, well, what about transference? That's always an issue that therapists have to deal with. How do you maintain that boundary with that love? I'm kind of curious.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, see, my earliest training as a psychologist was with a really wonderful supervisor who was really kind of orthodox psychodynamic. And for those of you who don't know the buzzwords, psychodynamic is sort of an offshoot of psychoanalysis. The psychoanalyst would say, it's the poor relative of psychoanalysis. It's where you sit up, you're not lying on a couch, and it's not every day. It's like maybe only 3 times a week or 2 times, whatever. And I learned a lot from it, so I don't mean to diss it. But one of the things about that approach that I started to realize was it is so focused on its own concepts that it often loses sight of stuff that doesn't fit the model so well. And transfers is a good example of that. It's not that is an empty concept, because it's not. People will often project on you, whatever. But I don't, as far as I can tell, I don't have the problem of people falling in love with me, because I don't expect that. I don't look for it. I'm not trying to analyze it. I'm really in a position that is very clear. And one of the reasons I really enjoy working with couples, especially even more than individuals, although I occasionally do work with individuals. But I like that fact of they are presenting the problems that they are defining, and I'm there to help them get to the bottom of it for themselves. And the transference thing comes up if you're expecting it. I'll give you one of my favorite examples of, it's when I knew I had to leave that particular nest and get some training in some other forms. It's when we were in a supervision group. It was a few students, and I was one of the students, and then our supervisor. Again, I say nothing bad about our supervisor, really nice guy. But one of the other students was talking about someone he'd been working with. And he said it was this guy he was working with, was a man, and he'd been working with him for a few weeks. And the guy came in one day and he said, "Wow, it's really amazing. I'm getting along better with my wife. I'm doing better at work. I think this is really helping." And the student commented, "It's obviously a flight to health." And what? Flight to health? And of course, that's not an empty concept either. It comes out of the psychodynamic principles, which is to say, it couldn't possibly be true that he's done enough work that he's really better. So it's a defense mechanism. He's acting better rather than confront the demons that he should be confronting. And I, little twerp that I was at the time, now I'm a big twerp, I don't know, whatever. I said, how can you tell the difference between a flight to health and actually getting better? Is it not possible that maybe he's actually getting better? Might you not want to ask about that? And, I was sort of looked at like, oh, there he goes again. Again, they're nice to me, but I finally said, no, that was enough. Because it's like same idea. If somebody, God forbid, a person, a patient or a client you're working with should say, "You know what, I think I'm done," that in classic psychodynamic precipitates a crisis, and it takes at least 6 months to work it out. As opposed to saying, "Oh, good, you're done. Cool. Call me if you want to come back if something comes up." I like the family doctor model a lot better. It's like, "Oh, you're feeling better. Cool. I'm happy to have more sessions with you if you think it's helpful, or if not, let me know." And I have worked with lots of people who've worked with me for a while and things have gone better. And then, something happens a year or 2 or 3. I've worked with folks. I've been doing this a long time. I've worked with folks on one relationship and then later on worked with them in another relationship. But that's, I actually tend to believe people if they say things are going better, so.
Yeah.
That's a long answer to your question about transference, but
that's all right. I didn't know. I had no idea where you'd even go. I mean,
the love part is it's not romantic love. It is genuine. It's not only love for those particular people. And I will tell you, there have been the occasional folks, like I'm a human being too. There have been the occasional person I've worked with. It's very difficult to love. And the longer I've done the work, the easier it's been. And the ones I used to have the hardest time with, the kind of love I'm talking about, would be the sort of asshole guys, because I can kind of recognize that in myself. It's like, oh, I know what that feels like. And I had to get to the point where I could feel okay about them too, and not for me to approve of bad behavior, but to have a sense of, no, I can appreciate everybody for who they are, including myself, and then we can work. And that's the groundwork where people are actually able to consider possibilities, that other than what they're stuck with.
Dr. Bruce Chalmer's book is Betrayal and Forgiveness. And as we're wrapping up the hour, there are three things we always like to do. I want to make sure we do all three of them with you. First and foremost, this is the most important one of all. Mm-hmm. Someone wants to find out more about you and read more about, and maybe even, God forbid, reach out and talk to you.
Yes.
How do they find you?
Easily done. They go to brucechalmer.com. brucechalmer.com will get you all sorts of information about me and my practice, which I can do like coaching practice and out of the states that I happen to be licensed in. I can do a coaching practice. And so brucechalmer.com will get you there. And also there's information about my books there, information about the podcast I mentioned, which I want to steer people to as well, Couples Therapy in 7 Words. That has a website, ctn7.com, but brucechalmer.com will get you there too. And I have, there's a blog on there that has all of the videos of our podcast episodes as well, so they can find out about me. brucechalmer.com is the way to do it.
All right, sounds good.
Beautiful.
Second thing we like to do is I like to go to my co-host, who always has a fabulous perspective, particularly Jody Lynn, because she is brilliant. But she always has a fabulous perspective on the conversation that just ties it together nicely. And I'm really curious on this one, Jody Lynn. What are you tying together today? Because I mean, I was even watching your face as we were doing the leading, and I could see the wheels turning. So I'm really curious to see what this is.
Oh man, I love this topic, and I'm so glad that you're here today, Bruce, with the invitation for us and those watching and the world to find a new perspective, because I wholeheartedly agree with you. I am the common denominator in my life, and so is everybody else in their own life. I take me everywhere I go, and I'm going to take my problems with me everywhere I go too. But I think forgiveness is such a huge piece. I grew up in a house where I watched my mother struggle to forgive her ex-husband, her kids. There was a lot of trauma and a lot of, pain inside of that. And I watched it destroy lots of relationships, including our own. And it wasn't until I began to forgive her and forgive myself that the world changed, or my world changed. And I think that it's the same thing for the rest of the world. I think we could alleviate a lot of pain if we were to look within and begin to forgive and let go and start to move on in a new way. So thank you for that reminder, Bruce.
Oh, thank you. That's a beautiful summary. Yeah.
Thank you.
I said she's brilliant. I mean, she really is. There's no doubt about it. Finally, I started to practice a few years ago when I noticed there's a gap in what we pay attention to and what we give credit for in the modern 21st century internet-driven society, where not only do we write books like you've done, but we do podcasts and we write articles and we do social media. We're putting out all this stuff to help people, and because people have realized the value. They go through that traumatic experience. They come out the other side. They found some tools along the way. They got to share them with the world. They got to help other people. And in the process, they're reaching out and touching people that they never met, never seen, never will meet, never will see, and producing results they never even hear about, and they never get credit for it.
Yeah.
And I say to myself, well, wait a minute. So, Bruce, on behalf of those people you've never met, never seen, never will meet, never will see, who you've been helping in ways you didn't even know about, on their behalf, thank you for what you're doing, because you're making a difference in this world.
Well, thank you for that. And thanks, Walt, and thanks, Jody Lynn. This has been a delightful conversation. I really appreciate it.
And we appreciate you as well. And thank you to our podcast listeners everywhere. We'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.